The following podcast may include coarse language, graphic content, and politically and/or religiously sensitive material. Those of you who are offended by such content should fuck off. To learn more about Daemoneye Publishing and download free products, visit our website at daemoneye.net. That's DAEMONEYE.net. Hey there, internets. Welcome to the Daemoneye Podcast, Episode 4, titled, What Measure is Non-Human? I'm Tristan Eifler.
I'm J. Tyler Burrell.
And this is the podcast where we discuss tabletop and electronic gaming, science, technology, geek cultures, and the 109 uses for a gazelle carcass.
You'd be amazed how much dental work is involved in that.
Yes, it's quite unfortunate. Pliers are very useful in this regard. So this is actually the new and improved Daemoneye podcast, since Tyler now has an actual recording device, which seems to be working very well.
I have a big white ball staring me in the face. It's kind of disturbing.
I was trying to do the black ball, Tyler, because I know how you love black balls, black things, but sorry, they only have the little white balls at Radio Shack.
I am totally not going there.
Well, I already went there. Well, at least the good news is that now you won't sound as though you're speaking through a 3-foot-long cardboard tube filled with radioactive buzzing bees.
Wow, deja vu.
Yes. So, let's see, a quick announcement. I'm actually going to start the Kickstarter for the Lycanthrope Club 2, the sequel to my first novel, probably very soon. Probably maybe around Monday or Sunday, depending upon whether I get all the files updated. So, if anyone is listening to that, it's probably going to be up by the time this podcast goes live or goes on YouTube. So please go ahead and check it out. There should be plenty of links in all the relevant usual spots. I need your support for this, and so does Daemoneye Publishing.
In the eternal words of Parker, attention must be paid.
Before we get started, I'm going to take a page from one of the web podcasts which inspired this one in the first place, and take some time to ask you, Tyler, how are you doing so far today?
Moderately well. Got some chores done. Basically, when we're done with this podcast, I'm going to be hopping in a hot soak. Big hot tub. I love it. The only reason I live here.
Mm-hmm. Yet I'm actually going to have to, after a little break, go back to the lab and finish an experiment. Science waits for no man.
I am so jealous.
Yes, so you're jealous of me having to walk about 2 miles up the rather steep hills and valleys of San Francisco to sit in a lab and stare at a blot for about an hour, whereas you go into a nice hot tub and in the middle of a very calm and peaceful location, relax. You're jealous of me?
I'd happily trade places with you.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, we have different opinions right now. Let's just go ahead and get on topic here, which is, again, the title from my surmise is How to Design, Write, and Roleplay Non-Human Races. So, I posit to you, Tyler, that there is a fundamental problem with this to begin with. What is that problem?
Alright, essentially what the problem is that the more alien a race is from the human perspective, or whether it's special or cultural, the harder it is to actually emulate that race. It's the old Star Trek people in funny costumes routine. If your alien race is just humans with a funny costume, but they still act like humans, it's very easy for an actor or a role player or an author to put themselves in the shoes of that alien race. The downside being, it's not really that alien. But the more alien the more alien you make your race, whether physically or psychologically, the more different they are, and oftentimes the funner they are to play, because the whole point, or the player right, because the whole point of all of this is the escapist fantasy. But the harder it becomes to stay in character.
I would say the problem is a little more fundamental than that. It's that any alien or fantasy race is by necessity a human creation. I mean, we can't really say that something is non-human when humans create it. I mean, yes, we could try to come up with values and ideas and norms which are radically different from any of ours, although it's difficult given the broad range of human societies, but fundamentally it's still derived from those. So, I mean, until we actually meet an honest-to-goodness separate race that did not evolve and had no contact with humans whatsoever, we can't really say something is truly non-human. That's, I think, the fundamental problem.
It's the anthropomorphic principle. We interact with everything around us in terms of what we perceive as a reflection of parts of us in it. We say, like when you're looking at the sky and you see a cloud and you go, "Oh, that cloud looks like a balloon." It doesn't. In reality, it just looks like a freaking cloud. But because we see the pattern of the balloon, we then project the factual opinion that cloud looks like a balloon.
Yeah, that's the anthropic principle. Was that the strong or the weak one? I forget. I've always had a little trouble with that one. So, I mean, that's the issue. That's the issue, I think, with this. It's a fundamental problem. Yeah, I mean, this actually brings me to one of my pet peeves, and this is a bit of a digression, but I think it's worth talking about. When someone's said, whenever in fantasy or sci-fi literature, we always say that humans are inherently bad, or inherently good, or inherently warlike, or inherently peaceful. I mean, putting aside the whole huge variety of humanity, good or bad or wise or warlike compared to what? It's all relative. I mean, I hate it when authors tend to do that. I mean, especially now, we haven't contacted another race, another species. So how even then it would still be relative, but we don't even have a reference point from which to place that. It really, I don't know. It just really bothers me when people do that in any medium.
Well, that's why in every medium, humans are always used as the baseline. For instance, in role-playing games, the ability scores and special abilities of different non-human races are always referred to baseline plus or minus some modifier. But humans, they never have the modifiers. They're always the baseline.
Yeah, man is a measure of all things, as my father might say. But I think it might be interesting to create a world where humans have a specific role in it beyond being Joe averages, just for variety's sake. Where you're in a world where humans are generally the strongest of many other smaller races, and they have a more set culture. I think that'd be kind of an interesting type of inhuman human race to create. That's one little way of tweaking it, which would be good fun. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are still humans, and therefore we measure everything else by our standards. It's not surprising. It's natural, and it's a good average point to work from.
Actually, a good example of what you're talking about is a trilogy of books called The Books of the Damned by Alan Dean Foster, where there's an interstellar war between two opposing philosophical factions, one of which is basically out to brainwash the entire universe and force them to serve them, whereas the other one is trying to allow everybody to have their own independent cultures and keep their own cultural identities, essentially so that they have trade partners. And eventually they encounter humans. And the big thing about humans in that universe is that as a species gets more and more technologically advanced, it becomes more and more peaceful, to the point where the really technologically advanced societies are genetically and psychologically incapable of violence. And then they come across Earth.
And if I recall correctly from the TV tropes page, I haven't read that Alan Dean Foster series. I think we also still had atomic weaponry on us.
Yeah, it's It's a very good example of a situation in which humans are not the baseline, but the reason humans aren't the baseline is because there's a human replacement race that's used for most of the first novel as the for the player's perspective, for the reader's perspective, to be the baseline, and then that particular race comes across humans, and the initial human pacifist that they come across just accidentally kicks all of their asses trying to escape when they do a first contact encounter.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to a nice little segue as to what, one of the things you need to think about when design a race. What is the purpose or what is the philosophy behind this race? What role they play in the setting or in the game? In the role playing games, typically it's you have the tough race, the smart race, the sneaky race, but I think you can move a little bit beyond that. Can you give any examples of that in, say, Dead Stars, Tyler?
Yes, in Dead Stars, I try to go for what ecological niche a race fills, and then expand outwards from there. For instance, the Helazara, who are the slimy used car salesmen of the galaxy. They are essentially what it says on the tin, a race of used car salesmen. They're the junkers and scavengers of the universe. They're also incredibly good at social interactions, and part of the reason for that is because they were one of 3 sentient races to evolve on their home world, and their particular evolutionary track gave them the ability to, through scent, influence the behaviors of others to make it sound like their ideas are just such good ideas, and over time they used that ability to convince the other two races that inhabited their world to wipe each other out. And then they discovered that they weren't alone in the universe, and they're essentially trying to make up for it for their genocide ever since.
But the thing is, that race, the Helazara, kind of fulfills that stereotype of the sneaky rogue race, which just happens to have a little biological add-on, which makes them better at it.
Well,
at least the
idea of them was, I didn't make a quote sneaky rogue race. I made a race that had an ecological niche that made it so that being a sneaky rogue was a beneficial advantage, and then I extrapolated how they would adapt and evolve in that situation afterwards, and then I ended up with a fully fledged and detailed race, instead of just saying, these are humans with a funny forehead and they get +4 to social skills.
I think a better version of the kind of standard stereotypes is actually the Circalth we created. They are at face value kind of what you would assume they would act as the kind of the mercenary warrior race. They are essentially giant armored cockroaches, the ones who survived and evolved following a nuclear war on a planet, and yet they aren't really particularly tough. But they're not really warlike per se. They are actually more like survivalists, and they also have an extremely strong idea of group community and some very interesting traditions. They aren't particularly warlike or no more than any other race. So I think they really do avert that even more so than, say, the Helazara. Then they have a role in the party and role in the ecology of the Dead Stars universe, too.
Yeah, out of all of the races in Dead Stars, Circalth are probably the most physically capable and toughest, but they're also, oddly enough, the most peaceful, but not the least dangerous, because Circalth's idea of a practical joke, like a joy buzzer or something like that, would be anybody else's idea, or would be anybody else's concept of a hand grenade whoopee cushion. For a Circalth, that's a joy buzzer.
Well, that's because they evolved on a volcanic planet with temperatures which would boil the blood of most individuals. So yeah, it's not a matter that they're cruel, just that everyone else is so much squishier than them, and most of the ones off planet get used to that idea, or are arrested by the authorities soon after shaking the hands of the local diplomat and murdering them.
Yeah, you don't shake hands with the Circalth. The Circalth's hands are designed for rapidly digging through solid rock in order to be able to get from point A to point B in a nuclear radioactive hellhole.
Oh yes, and their equivalent of chickens pose a serious danger to most of the races because they can tear through armor like it was butter.
For Surkalth, that's a household pet.
Yes, and what is the anecdote you love to tell about the Surkalth regarding their what is in regards to that medical book?
Yes. In Dead Stars, there's this thing called the Universal Guide to First Aid. It's essentially just like a little quick cheat sheet book that has basic first aid procedures for all of the different races. You know, how to how to stop a wound or how to stop a bleeding wound for a Helizara as opposed to for a human. Then each race has its own chapter. The Surkalth even have their own chapter, but their chapter only has one sentence and then an explanation of that sentence. The sentence is, Surkalth are tough bastards. The explanation of that sentence is, anything that has damaged a Surkalth to the point of them requiring first aid has long since killed any other species capable of rendering said first aid.
Mm-hmm. They can actually survive brief moments in a space too, if I'm not mistaken. Not for that long. They're not that tough.
The main benefit of their extreme endurance is the main downside, I should say, of their extreme endurance is the fact that it has an hourly time limit. They can survive in damn near any environment, no matter how hellish. But only for a number of minutes every hour equal to their Constitution score before they have to break the seal on their exoskeleton in order to refresh their internal compensatory chemicals. Let's basically think of them as having an internal store of binary antifreeze, binary internal organ that can store enough oxygen for them to not need to breathe for 20 minutes, so on and so forth. But eventually all those chemicals deplete themselves and need to be refreshed.
And they also have a very high racial priority, so if you play as one, to be balanced in the game, you probably won't have a lot of money or be the best specimen of the species.
Well, how are you going to... money is usually used for gear, and we're talking about a race that doesn't go swimming in the local... when they go swimming in the local creek just happens to be lava. A little hard to keep
enough gushing about... All right. Enough gushing about that race. Let's kind of go to more fundamental questions. So you were describing how the races in Dead Stars kind of fulfill an ecological niche, and that's one thing you have to do when you create a race. And what I think about is what informs them. What situations led to them having this particular culture? I mean, it's a very complex issue, of course, and entire disciplines of social sciences are dedicated to kind of answering that question. But, something as simple as a language can sometimes explain certain cultures and attitudes. I'm not sure if this is accurate, but I've heard somewhere that in the Spanish language, for example, when you say something is lost, you say what the literal mean is it lost itself. Therefore, among Spanish-speaking people, if you say you lost something, you're not really saying that you lost it, it's that it lost itself. And from that perspective, language can kind of shape someone's way someone thinks, so that they don't think the person who lost it made such a big deal because it lost itself as opposed to I lost it.
Yeah, I'm going to have to take your word on that one. After all, ich spreche Deutsch, nicht Española.
Yeah, I don't speak Spanish either. I remember hearing that, and I'm sure someone on the comments board will correct me if I'm wrong, but even if it's not true, you can imagine a similar situation. Language does shape one's thoughts. I mean, that's one way you can try to, one avenue to kind of round your race out. If they have, think about their language and think about how their language is constructed. I mean, it seems kind of odd to go straight to a race's language as opposed to, say, where they, their origin and so forth, but it can actually be a good way to come up with ideas because it can shape so much about a culture and a people and a race.
Yeah, what you don't want to do when designing an alien race is start at the end. You don't want to say okay, I'm going to make a race of warriors or I'm going to make a race of scholars, because then you have to backfill and make justifications, and you end up a lot of times with a very illogical or a self-contradictory result. it's much better if you have an idea about where you want to go, but then you start at the beginning and say, okay, if we start off with a race of, I don't know, six-armed no-legged crystal people, or what would they have to go through during the course of their sociological development to end up as a race of scholars?
Mm-hmm. Well, you could also basically start with a race's history, then go from there and decide, how their environment shaped them and if there were any significant events during their world's history that would modify that, and it's hard to do that without referring to, existing human cultures, but it's really the only way to go about it. So let's look at, say, the, what's a good example? Arab culture, perhaps. It's many Arab cultures existed in very arid landscapes where water is a commodity, where there are small sections of land which are arable, but others are not, and a tradition of hospitality arose in there, which persists to this day to some extent. So, can you kind of backtrack from there? Why that is?
Actually, if you're looking at the North African and Arab area, a better example wouldn't be where it is today, but where it all started, but all the different cultures that existed there back in the day. Right now, you have one cancerous philosophy that's just consuming the entire area with violence, violence and oppression. But that's a recent development. Back in the day, you had things like not Timbuktu. Timbuktu was a slave state, but there was another area that was very similar to Timbuktu, a solitary town out in the middle of the desert that has survived because of an exclusive water source. I cannot, for the life of me, remember the name of it, even though it was on an episode of Cosmos with Carl Sagan. But it basically formed a stopover point on a couple of trade routes, and especially for the time, it was a bucolic paradise. While there was slavery, it wasn't nearly the nasty, harsh form of slavery that they had over in Timbuktu. It was basically it was penile slavery. If you committed a crime, rather than being executed, you were forced into public servitude until your debt to the public had been paid off. For instance. So you ended up, we have an example of two places that have virtually identical setups: Timbuktu and
wherever the place was called.
We'll call it Cosmos Land. Timbuktu and Cosmos Land. I really wish I could remember the name of it. It's okay. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But anyways, you have two places that are out in the middle of the desert, have a dedicated water source, and are located near or on trade routes. Timbuktu is a slave state that goes to war frequently against neighboring towns and villages, basically to capture more slaves. Their entire infrastructure is run by slave labor. Cosmos Land, I cannot remember the name of it for the life of...
Just give it up.
Yeah. Well, it instead has a parliamentary representative democracy, while it still has slavery, because slavery was basically the thing of the day. All slaves there are held in public trust, and they're only slaves working for the public good until they've worked off their debt. Over in Timbuktu, they would have slaves in huge hamster wheels, just running in the hamster wheel constantly, day in, day out, in order to extract water via a paddle wheel system to do irrigation. Whereas in the other place, they had the slaves building aqueducts to make, or for essentially automatic irrigation systems that you just had to pull, or they just had to pull up a wooden divider, water goes sluicing through, and then you shut the divider when you're done.
All right, we've established these are two different cities on pretty much the same situation. So, why are they different then?
That's the big issue. If anything, I would say that the main reason they were different is that probably because Timbuktu had a single homogeneous culture that established it, whereas the other one just came about over time on this trade route because somebody found water in the middle of a trade route and started digging, made a small little stopover point so people didn't have to carry quite so much water with them going across the trade route, and then somebody noticed that who was carrying a bunch of seed to go to seed to trade at another city, and decided to stop and went it'd be better off if I just started farming seed here, because then I wouldn't have to transport it as far for subsequent crops. And then suddenly, instead of having only one culture or people from one culture and society running an area, you now have two people splitting that culture and society, which causes it to grow. And then a third one comes by, notices that there's seed being grown here, that there's water available here, and it's in the middle of a trade route, and hey, this would be a perfect place for a tavern. And then it just barrel rolls on down from there. You have three cultures running the place, and then people from four cultures, and then it just snowballs.
Okay, so let's ask a little deeper question here. Why did a single homologous culture rise to power in Timbuktu? Why did it not in the other city, which you cannot, for the life of you, recall the name of?
Tyranny of the majority. In Timbuktu, you had one culture that had the majority, or that had the majority of the power, and no repercussions for abusing it. And
I understand it, but why did that come about then? Why did it not come about in the other city?
Oh, because Timbuktu was the end of a trade route. It wasn't the beginning of it wasn't the middle of a trade route. Timbuktu was basically established. If I remember correctly, the current theory is because a band of nomads found the water source that fueled Timbuktu completely by accident. Because the group that found the water source for Timbuktu were the only ones that actually had access to it in the beginning. So essentially they hoarded it. Nobody else was going to come by because it was out in the middle of the desert. And over time they built a city and started raiding surrounding cities. People noticed that there was a culture out in the middle of the desert. A trade route developed, and it just went on from there. So basically, I think the main difference between the philosophies of the two is that Timbuktu was able to develop initially in isolation to the point where the culture that found and developed it was able to hold all of the power, whereas the other location was not founded in isolation. It was a situation where it was a melting pot. People were forced from different cultures were forced to adapt to one another and live together, because the alternative was everybody dying of thirst.
So that single act of kind of selfishness in the beginning precipitated this long and unfortunate culture. So you can imagine transposing that into say, a fantasy setting where a single race of humans pull that, and another race of humans became more heterogeneous, and it turned out for the better. Yeah, and from that you can develop a culture, or you can say one race usually just enslaved other races, or another race, say like the elves in this one. Well, not usually the elves, because they're usually very haughty. Let's say instead the halflings did this, and we're in the other city. Then you can say that kind of defined what a halfling is: very adaptable, very generous, willing to live with others. That's how you could say that this culture, racial identity began. So that's the way you can go about it.
It'd be hilarious if you made a fantasy setting such as that, where the whole reason that the town all the different races start coming together is because the halflings are the social glue.
Well, that's actually their classical role in like D&D Second Edition was because they didn't really have a homeland. They didn't really have they had a strong racial identity, but they didn't really have this almost. Don't want to call it nationalistic, but this very, very halfling-centric view. Well, they did, but they were just very adaptable. They often lived with other races. They didn't really establish nations, but they did very well with other countries. Were very adaptable within reason, and that would actually could use that. You kind of transpose that idea into this real world culture and say, okay, this is how the halfling culture developed. It's a little different in that they are still kind of the rulers in this new city, but the fundamental character is the same, and you get a very rounded, logical, cogent, and interesting history behind this race all of a sudden.
Actually, I've always found that a really interesting take on halflings. Since if you look at, or since statistically they're supposed to be like sneaky and roguelike.
That was third edition, Tyler. In second edition, they were basically homebodies who occasionally did really, really awesome things, like in The Hobbit. But they couldn't call it The Hobbit because of copyright reasons.
Yes, but what I'm trying to say is that a very interesting take to do on halflings is to actually make them into nomads, not by choice but by necessity. Make them the outcasts. They have to wander from place to place and from town to town, surviving by their wits and their skills, because nobody wants to give them a home. Why does nobody want to give them a home? Because they have a reputation for being thieving little scoundrels. Why do they have a reputation for being thieving little scoundrels? Because it's the only way they can survive being kicked from one place to another. So, catch-22.
Yep. Gee, what's analog in the real world? Does this remind? What analog of this in the real world can you think of?
Football players?
I'm sorry?
Football players?
I was going to say the Roma or the Gypsies of Europe.
Oh, no, that's just racist.
Yeah, I know it is.
In case you can't tell, I'm just messing with you.
But so is that viewpoint of halflings, though, right?
Well, that's kind of, when you're looking at a fantasy setting, when you're building new races, designing racial cultures, and so on. At that point, if you want to be honest, racism is the norm. Because you're defining an entire species. It's true racism, not the ethnocentric racism that we have in the real world. Because you're defining the behaviors of an entire freaking sentient species on the basis of their stature or whether or not they have pointy ears. Oh, you have pointy ears. You must be haughty and like to hang out in the woods.
Yeah, that's another fundamental problem because it's not just a matter of on human, but we don't have a culture. We're not in a situation where we have ever had other entirely different species living side by side. So it's kind of hard to imagine what would happen. How that play out. I mean, the closest analogy is other culturally defined human races. People from Africa, people from Asia, and so forth. But that's supposed to be a different scale. I mean, for example, in the Discworld series, there really isn't any racism per se. I mean, it's a few characters in the novel did have some racist attitudes, but they were looked upon as being freaks of nature for being so intolerant. As Terry Pratchett put it, white and black got together just fine and ganged up on green, because in Discworld there's speciesism, not racism.
And heightism.
Oh yeah, height. Well, that's. Oh yeah, the dwarves. Yes, very good. Oh yeah, but anyway, that's another problem. So you have to also imagine what interracial. I mean, not interracial, interspecial relationships. What would they be like? Because that's a extremely complex topic. Which if humanity encounters other species and other sentient species, that would be basically an entirely scientific discipline or social scientific discipline in itself would be created. So I mean, it's a hard thing to do.
That's also where you can get a lot of the reasons why you have humanoid races like goblins and orcs and whatnot, that are antagonistic to the quote-unquote player character races. And think about it. Let's say if for some weird reason goblins just really, really, really like the taste of elf flesh, well, then there's two species are gonna have a problem.
Well, there actually is an example of that. I mean, in Dark Sun, the Thri-Kreen love the taste of elf. That's just the fact of nature.
Yeah, exactly.
Or what if you had a sentient race which, by necessity, that in order to reproduce, would have to reproduce by, say, eating the brains of another sentient race and implying their larvae in them.
I wonder what tentacled monstrosity you're referencing.
I would say their name on the air, but unfortunately, if I did that, again, visit from the nice little man over from Hasbro / Wizards of the Coast. Let's just call them the Brain Whippers.
How about we call them the Cthulhuoids?
Okay, fair enough. Anyways, but
after all, that is where they ripped off the idea.
Yeah, I mean then the race is and the race of course is evil, and in a game like D&D, evil is a very real and cosmic force. But I mean, if you didn't have that aspect, could you really? I mean, they're just doing what they have to do to survive. It's a biological necessity that forces them to be at odds with humanoids. Could you even other sentient races? Could they ever have a normal or non-aggressive relationship with them? And is that even justified then? That's another interesting approach, which you can probably find better examples of that in science fiction than fantasy, because again, you can have the excuse of, evil is a real fundamental force here,
If you want to get really deep into the weirdness, you can always explore the question of how did they come about?
That was actually brought up or hinted at in a couple of in a couple of source books and one mega adventure, I think. But I digress, sort of.
Yeah, but just because it was explained in a source book or adventure or whatever, doesn't mean that that's the explanation that you have to use in your world for such a creature.
Mm-hmm. So what might you use then?
I would probably use something like a cogenerative or evolution. You would have a creature that is like the wasp that implants its larva into another creature in order for its larva to have food when it hatches and emerges. And this creature evolved in an environment with another creature, and they start that it was its preferential prey, and it was its preferential prey because brain meats, whatever. But the other creatures started to develop a more sentient brain capacity, and as a survival mechanism, the idea being that if you can better conceive of the behavior of another creature, if you can better emulate it in your predator's mind, then you're going to be better able to avoid it. Then the predator, in order to actually catch its prey so that it can continue to breed and spawn a new generation, has to start evolving the ability to emulate the prey's mind to figure out where the prey is going to be hiding, and you end up in an intellectual arms race. And over time, you could easily have a biological justification stating that the predator creature, over time, its larvae become dependent on the presence or on the biochemical mass of a sentient mind in order to be able to breed. So over time, it just becomes incapable of breeding without a sentient mind. But that doesn't mean that its original prey creature. Let's say that Cthulhuoids and the original prey creature were goblins. That doesn't mean that its original prey creature is the only prey creature that it could actually use this, or that it could actually breed with. If eventually they come across, orcs, humans, dwarves, whatever, and they, in an attempt to try to breed with them and discover, hey, these things actually have enough biochemical brain mass that my larva can gestate. Well, suddenly the entire world opens up.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, and actually, that's more or less how those creatures, which I will not refer to in their name, breed. At least in the original, one of the major source books.
EA Tentacle Kafagan.
Yes. All right. Enough skirting around that. So, yeah. So unusual biology, alien biology, can be used to create a lot of tension. It can create some realistic antagonistic and more thoughtful antagonism rather than simply orcs and goblins are inherently evil and barbarous and radiant creatures. They are open. They are basically free game on them. No moral quandaries involved. I'm killing them.
You can also use sociology for a similar effect.
Yeah, but again, you have to, we're going back to the question, how is that, how those attitudes and opinions evolve, and are they justified in any way, or are they surely prejudice? I mean, it also kind of gets into what game or what story you're trying to write. If is it more classical, where it's just kind of swords and sorcery, or or classic science fiction where aliens with rubber foreheads are all evil, or do you want something more thoughtful? Because how deep you make your races often reflects how deep you want your stories to be, because the stories are just places where the races interact, or the characters interact who are of all these races.
You also have to remember that in any given population, especially the larger the population gets, you're going to have variance within that population. You can have you can have an entire race of forest-dwelling, aloof scholars with pointy ears, and eventually, over time, and with a large enough group of numbers, you're going to end up with somebody who's born who doesn't like the woods, who prefers the city.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that actually brings to another important topic in different races. You decide one race, but are all members of the race more or less the same thing? In Star Trek, all Klingons are pretty much 99 out of 100 Klingons are all warlike, boisterous, warrior types.
Freaks.
I mean, honor freaks. Yes, I mean there are very few variations. Whereas if right now on planet Earth you can find a person who is very pacifistic and a classical vegan loving hippie from San Francisco. Compare that to say an angry warlord over in one of the more war torn African countries. I mean they would be nothing alike. They're the same race. You see this a lot in science fiction and you also see it in fantasy where all members of the race are of the same culture, but different races have different cultures. You can't just, when you make a race, making a single culture where the culture and the race are one and the same is very lazy. I mean, you have a little bit of more variation in D&D, believe it or not, where you have the sub-races, gray elf, wood elf. You also have the kind of less used, but still, extent, still documented, tall fellows, stouts, halflings, for example, but you don't see a lot of that in a lot of this. You see a lot of attempts to broaden the cultures when you have, the fact of the matter is when you have a larger race, you have a lot of individuals, there's going to be a lot of variations, a lot of different cultures, and they will probably, over time end up very different from each other. However, there's a counter argument to this, which I think Tyler's brought up in the past, and that, this probably comes up more in science fiction. In order for a race to develop the technology and the base, or industrial base, to reach the stars, they have to reach some level of consensus where more or less the entire planet, or the majority of the population, or the majority is in sync to some regard. So that's you can understand, you can imagine that bringing a certain level of cultural homogeny to the race as a whole. So that's kind of excusable, but not to the degree you sometimes see in science fiction and fantasy, where it's just what you see one dwarf is all the same with some minor quirks.
Yeah, something you have to keep in mind is that the more advanced technologically a society becomes, the more specialized the members of and interdependent the members of that society to become. When you're dealing back in caveman days, everybody had to know how to do everything, because your society at that point was at most a couple of dozen individuals. So damn near everybody had to know how to hunt, had to know how to take care of the kids, had to know how to cook, had to know how to make spears, had to know how to make a fire, so on and so forth. Because you never know who would end up having to do it. But then as we developed a better technology, people started discovering that, like, they had more nimble. Bob had more nimble had the most nimble fingers in the tribe, so Bob can do better stitching. And say Alex had the best eyes in the tribe, so Alex was the best hunter, so on and so forth. Over time, that specialization and interdependency becomes more and more pronounced, to the point where you end up with a society that's where nobody is capable of doing everything. Particularly when you take into account the amount of time it takes to do something. Consider a cooper, which is somebody who makes barrels, can make a barrel using water, wood, and copper or iron bands. All right, that's great. As long as he has the materials, he can make barrels all the livelong day. But he needs to have the materials, so he needs a carpenter or a woodworker for the slats for the barrel. He needs a millwright to be able to get water off of a water wheel in order to fill the barrel, because there's no way you want to do it by hand over and over and over again. He needs a blacksmith in order to make the metal bands, and the blacksmith himself needs miners in order to mine the ore that he needs to smelt for the metal bands, and it just daisy chains from there. And that's just to make a freaking barrel. How involved is it to make a starship?
Yeah, I think that for those listeners who are interested, there's actually a really good book on this topic. I forget the title, but it essentially chronicles one man's effort to make from scratch. And by scratch, I mean literally from the raw materials taken from the earth or chopped down, a toaster. It's quite an interesting read. That said, specialization within a society doesn't necessarily mean it becomes more fragmented or leads to new cultures or subcultures. I mean, Japan became relatively advanced. Was very advanced for its time as far as technology, but it had a very homogeneous culture.
Well, yeah, it had a homogeneous culture because it was also a very insular location. For the longest time, the only people that the people of Japan could talk to were the other people of Japan. It was, while Japan admittedly stretches over huge portions of latitude, if you take a look at it on a map, you'll notice that when you're dealing with a relatively primitive society, like back during the Dark Ages or so, the only people they're ever going to freaking be able to encounter are other Japanese people. So over time, you'll end up with a lot of cultural drift and homogenization as one person gets a bright idea on how to do something. And that bright idea then percolates upwards through the islands, downwards through the islands. But there's never or almost never any outside influence coming in to cause a shift in how the culture develops. It's also one of the reasons Japan has such a radically different culture from most of the rest of the Asian countries, is because it developed its early culture in almost total isolation.
Well, yes, it is, but it is a little more complicated than that. I mean, Japan has a long history of borrowing ideas and even cultural constructs from early on from China and Korea and later from the European countries. But then again, look at Great Britain. It's Great Britain was also an island. It was also relatively isolated from the rest of Europe, and yet it definitely has more unique or more sense of more unique cultural identity. But it's still, you could say, it was much more open, much more open, adaptable culture, much more influenced, I think, than Japan was.
There's a fundamental misconception in what you're stating, Tristan. While England is an island country, the English Channel can be crossed in a rowboat.
True. It's a little hard to cross over to Korea from Japan. Absolutely, the seas are a little more turbulent there, I think.
And longer.
A little longer, yes. Okay, so but there was still a stronger identity which was established there for whatever reason. I think the points behind all this, whether what I said was correct or you said was correct or neither, who knows? And we're not experts on this per se. But there are multiple factors that influence, that influence these two cultures, and as a result, they can still wind up very differently. There's geography, there's when or how long it was isolated. It was also matter of resource availability. For example, iron was much for a while was not too uncommon in Japan, but eventually they exhausted the supplies got exhausted, and that's why they used, I think, the metal they had they made very fine swords because there was less metal to work with, and therefore they were very careful with what they had. Whereas England, they had an abundance of iron and coal, and so they helped precipitate the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, resources go into a lot of it as well. You're right on that. Another good example is ancient China, which developed a massively impressive technology with almost no metal, because the near-surface metal deposits in ancient China were practically non-existent. China does have a lot of metal, but it's so deep down that you really gotta dig for it. So they developed entire technological disciplines based on bamboo. Freaking bamboo. They developed rocketry using bamboo.
And that's another point. Geography need not dictate how advanced or how powerful a culture is. A culture that grows up in a very desolate or resource poor location may overcome and because they overcomes these limitations, becomes one of the more powerful cultures. That's kind of the dark sun philosophy. The strong survive. The strong evolve in a very challenging location and then become dominant.
Yeah,
that will also influence their culture.
To refer to China again, even to this day, they build some of the most amazingly elaborate structures for scaffolding, for construction work usually, out of bamboo. Structures that are like stories upon stories in height, with bridged walkways and ladders, and it's practically a freaking building out of itself. And they usually build it around a work site, and they use that scaffolding as a work platform to build a solid structure building out of concrete, rebar, whatever. Whereas here in the West, we use cranes, and they just make it out of plant matter.
Well, bamboo is a pretty amazing building material, actually, given its properties. It has, if it's like, I'm thinking, one piece of bamboo isn't that strong, but if you even combine some of it or some of their fibers into a single structure and a single pillar, it has a lot of resistance, actually, a lot of strength to it.
And that's actually my point. Bamboo evolved and developed pretty much exclusively in China. So what would have happened if instead of bamboo evolving in China, bamboo had evolved in England? And China got all of the iron. Or all of the easy access iron, I mean. How would how would just that one change have massively affected the world going forward from the Middle Ages?
All right. So let's see what else. So another one thing we might with fantasy universes, another factor which can influence a culture is, of course, magic itself. You don't have this. We don't have this force in the real world, so you also don't have actual, in a lot of fantasy worlds, a lot of races are actually created by gods. And unlike the gods in the real world, these are gods which some priests can actually talk to or even call down from the heavens and say, hey, how's it going? So how does that influence a culture, you think?
A good corollary not corollary, but a good way of viewing magic is viewing it as a type of technology. You have to wonder, is magic is the magic technology homogeneous, or is it exclusive, or is it restricted or born by traits? To consider, if magic is homogeneous, that means everybody has equal access to all of it. Then it's essentially just another fact of life. It's like saying air or earth or water or whatever. But if magic has a trait to it, like let's say only dwarves can do magic or can enchant metal items, then suddenly only dwarves are making magic items. Or let's say magic is actually resource based, like you need a particular crystal, or there are certain nexus locations in the world where magic comes from, and the closer you are to them, the more powerful your magic is. Then you are going to have a competition between different civilizations in the world to gain access and control over these locations as they compete with one another for political power and dominance.
Mm-hmm. That does make it a lot easier, and it really does kind of just evolve into it's another form of technology, another resource. But I think another a little more different, a little more complex situation which considers that when you have, the origin of the race, if you have a race which was literally created by, say, the gods, or to have some certain purpose, like the goblins were created to serve, Orgothorpe the destroyer, and all goblins know this instinctively, or they have like a guardian race that guards a certain location. If you have individuals who differ from that, there might be more consequences than just being, say, shunned or rejected by your people. And then also, there's also the problem of, inherently evil races or inherently good races which come into play there. How much can an individual differ, from his fellows without really breaking believability, That gets that problem, of players who want to play players who want to play things like ogres or digesters in D&D. I'm a sentient digester.
Yeah, right. You might as well be a sentient desk chair.
Yeah, but they argue that that's probably a bad example. That any other sentient race it's a sentient race. They're supposed to be born of darkness, but I'm an exception to that race. That's kind of annoying, but they kind of do have a point when there's a sentient being. And sentient beings, as far as we know, based on what we know about humanity and our psychology, there can be a lot of variation within individuals. There could be a friendly, happy, gentle ogre.
Well, a good example of how to balance that in an actual party is to just have the world at large treat them as if they weren't. Because as far as the world at large is concerned, all ogres like to steal and eat little children. Because, the vast majority of ogres that anybody ever experiences like to steal and eat little children, as an example.
Yeah, but then you run into the problem, then that kind of, if you more and more reflect upon that, you think to yourself, in this fantasy world, you can't feel totally, if you're playing the classic good versus evil trope here in a fantasy game like D&D, you can't really go around slaughtering ogres and orcs with impunity anymore, can you?
Not once you know that at least one of them is actually a decent guy.
Yeah, what if, and the forces that are supposed to make them that way, are they purely magical, purely biological, purely cultural? I mean, it's kind of, sweeps the rug underneath these ideas or these concepts we have in the real world, which makes it a little more tricky. And again, it's a matter of how deep do you want to go. If you want to go deep, it can be a little tricky, but it can also be more rewarding. But if you want to keep it simple, keep it simple.
Yeah, whether or not you want a very detailed, in-depth analysis of the nature of good and evil and the individual's role in that struggle, or whether or not you just want to have a quick and fun popcorn experience running around shooting trolls in the face.
Yeah, the problem again there is that, in a lot of fantasy worlds, evil and good are actual fundamental forces. You can have like a blast of pure good or an energy blast of pure evil or pure chaos, so forth. Then it gets even trickier because these are supposed to be forces that are driving them, not, that influence and corrupt them or purify them. But then you have even worse, you have celestial beings like demons and devils where they're body is actually made up of this stuff. I mean, they have their own culture, so to speak, there, but they're fundamentally kind of biased in a certain way.
Actually, what I find with outsiders and extraplanar beings, what I find works really well is to invert the paradigm. Instead of viewing them as sources of good, you view them as created by the good that others do. Literally, acts of kindness would be acts of kindness and generosity and charity would be a celestial being's version of ham and steak and eggs or a ham dinner.
Yeah, but then could they really be considered fundamentally, truly sentient, beings on the same level or the same degree as other creatures? I mean, you couldn't. Because they are born from the thoughts of others and they're influenced by it, they kind of lack their own agency to a certain extent.
Hey, you and I are made out of the chemical interactions that come from the oxygen that we breathe and the sustenance, food and drink that we take in. Does that mean that we don't have our own sense of agency because we're made out of
Yeah. Point taken. But it's a matter of it's far more direct with them.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely more direct, and that actually kind of makes it fun. Consider what happens to a celestial being that tries to encourage goodness, kindness, and generosity in, say, an orc village where everybody's favorite pastime is kick the toddler.
It would
suddenly they're surrounded by a culture that's, let's face it, not exactly a nice one. How would that change them at a biological level?
If they have a true biological system, so to speak of, or they would just be inherent to it. I mean, it's basically water. It's basically water meets fire, essentially.
And would it just result in their starvation and annihilation, or would they slowly twist and change over time, coming up with justifications and reasons for like, okay, maybe instead of kick the toddler, maybe we'll just say slap the toddler. After all, it isn't as bad as kicking the toddler.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of different ways you can twist that, make that work, but. That's something to consider when you're dealing with this. You're dealing with that in fantasy. Sci-fi, unless you're going a really weird route, like where it reads more like a young adult's novel, like Wrinkle in Time, where you have hard sci-fi, but you also have things like love defeating galaxy-eating horrors. You don't have that problem as much. So, but in fantasy, that can come up a little bit. So, you have to learn how to deal with it. Okay, I think we're up to about an hour now, though I'll probably cut it down a little bit considering all the problems we had during the recording. Are there any other thoughts you want to add, Tyler?
No, that's about it. There are examples that I could give of how alien and fantasy races were done really well, and other examples where they were done really poorly. Cautionary examples.
I think that could go on for an entire other hour. So let's just kind of stop it here, and end the podcast. All right. This has been the Daemoneye podcast, episode 4. What measure is non-human? I'm Tristan Eifler.
I'm J. Tyler Burrell.
And thank you for listening. Again, check out the Kickstarter for the Lycanthrope Club Book 2 project, and we'll talk to you next month. See ya.
Hey, Victus.